Pacesetters, Rebeka Garcia Cook.
Something I find curious are people who sacrifice their own desires to create the success of others. I understand collaborating with others, modifying aspects of one's own dreams and desires, but purposefully putting them aside to contribute to somebody else's success? Wow. I once read a short story by Roger Bannister titled The 4-Minute Mile. It's the 1850s, and the running world has their sights set on the 4-minute mile. But by 1886, the 4-minute mile was considered a running impossibility. 15 miles an hour, people can't run that fast. But in the 1950s, the dream stirred again in the hearts of 3 men. Chris Chathaway, Roger Bannister, and Chris Brasher were skilled runners training together to see who could claim victory first, which one of them would do the impossible. However, victory was elusive, and so a decision was made. Chathaway and Brasher decided instead of running to win, they would run alongside Roger Bannister. They chose instead to set a pace for him and rotated running laps with him. You see, Roger Bannister didn't have a sense of beat. He couldn't maintain a cadence on his own. So the 2 men ran with him so that the 4-minute mile could be conquered. But in doing it, they forfeited their own opportunity, their own heart's desire to achieve something that they saw as greater than themselves. A few years back, I did something. I launched a dream that I had been nurturing and striving towards for almost 10 years. I was ready. But 2 weeks later, the principal from my son's school called me. Your son got into a fight on the playground. Then he started arguing with the teacher that intervened. Rebeka, he was belligerent and threatening. The social worker was able to calm him down, but she wants to talk to you too. I knew my son was hurting. I saw his back clothing. I watched his grades plummet. I noticed his anger on a constant simmer, which would sometimes just burst forth, and he scowled constantly. But I had no idea he was hurting so much that my son wanted to end his life. I had a choice. I could run my race, or I could run alongside him. I could put my dream on hold. 10 years. I had a race I really wanted to run, but my son had a race that he had to run. So I chose to run beside him. And I ran beside him as we visited pediatric mental health specialists. When things like depression and suicidal ideations and anxiety and ADD were mentioned, I ran with him 2 to 3 times a week for months seeking mental health care. Hours were spent researching and reading, trying to comprehend what he was experiencing and looking for hope. I ran along beside him as my own dream idled. But my dream idled because there was something greater I was striving for. I ran for my son. I ran for his life, not mere existence, but in hope that he would find joy and meaning. I ran so that the world would not miss out on him. Then one day, he smiled, gazed at his face in wonder. It had been so long since I had seen him smile. I had forgotten what it looked like. And the day he laughed, oh, he laughed. He was humored by something, and he laughed. And his laughter was foreign to me. I hadn't realized how far in despair he had traveled alone. 3 minutes, 59 and 4/10 of a second. Roger Bannister did it. The ripples went through the running world, and no longer was 4 minutes a cap. No longer was it impossible. Headlines around the world shouted, "Roger Bannister bests the 4-minute mile." But in his story, he credits his team, his pacemakers. He says he could not have accomplished it without Chris Chathaway and Chris Brasher. It was their victory, he states. But they didn't receive the accolades. History doesn't record them as the men who ran the 4-minute mile. 46 days later, the 4-minute mile was defeated again. And 1 year later, 3 runners bested the time again in a single race. The 4-minute mile. The sacrifice of Chathaway and Brasher. Their sacrifice gave hope, and it gave confidence to the others in the form of Roger Bannister's victory. So I'm curious, what are you willing to sacrifice for? What is significant enough for you to put aside your own good desires to contribute to someone else? And how will you give hope and confidence to others? Contest Master, I had my son's permission to tell that story.